I'm Tony Lockwood, founder of Thompson Wright Partners, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest episode of Inside Track, where I discuss business transformation journeys with leading figures in industry. After a short break for the summer holidays, I'm delighted to be back with the latest episode of the Inside Track podcast. Today, I'm joined by Kieran Duck, an Australian transformation leader that's recently written a book. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little more detail as we go through the show. But I'd be delighted to introduce you to him now. So here's Kieran. So after a short break for summer holidays, it's great to be back and to welcome you to the Inside Track podcast, Kieran. Thank you for agreeing to join us. Yeah, I'm also pleased to say that you're the first Australian that we've had on the pod, so hopefully the first of many in the coming months. But thank you very much for joining us.
No, really pleased to be here.
Absolutely. After a career within top consultancies, you established a boutique before moving into the corporate life in Qantas. And in recent years, you've moved back into leading transformations across various organisations and sectors. So obviously that's a very whistle-stop tour of your 30-plus year experience in change and transformation. And I'm sure we'll explore more as we go through the show. But please, can you let the listeners know a little bit more about you and the rationale for your career decisions that you've taken today?
Yeah, sure. So I've been involved in project rescues, business transformations for quite a few years. In fact, somebody pointed out the other day that was since last century, which wasn't very flattering, but definitely true. So as you mentioned, I've been advised at all sorts of different companies, financial services, mines, railways, all sorts of things, and been accountable for some transformation. So there's a few scars along the way. I mean, most recently, I was a transformation director in an electricity utility, which is a fascinating industry. It's changing at a phenomenal pace. Certainly as the price of renewables comes down and climate change is having effect, that business had that problem of both trying to catch up to being at the industry standard, but also the industry itself was changing so rapidly, changing expectations of customers and shareholders. And so that was a really dynamic and changing situation. And it's that sort of thing that draws me to transformations, the fact that it is never the same. It's always moving. It's always changing.
That's a perfect segue into the first question of every one of these pods. How do you define transformation?
Yeah, I think many people, when defining transformation, focus on the change in people, process, and technologies. I've always thought of transformation as it's an act of opening up possibility for what's next. The possibility for a better way of operating, better way of serving customers, better way of competing and staying in business. I mean, when I was at Qantas, we went through a transformation that took out $2 billion worth of cost, and 5,000 jobs were reduced. I mean, it was tough. A lot of good people left the organisation, but what happened was we came out the other side of that journey with increased customer satisfaction, employee engagement, and profitability. Now, with hindsight, that was quite a few years ago, but it made it possible to weather the current turmoil that the aviation industry has been in for the past 2 years. If we hadn't done that transformation, it's unlikely that Qantas would be anywhere near what it is, in the position it's in today and being able to recover after the pandemic.
And was the driver for that to reduce cost, or was the driver to improve customer satisfaction? What was the main driver for that transformation?
There was need to move on all dimensions, but one of the crucial ones was the fact that the organisation wasn't returning its cost of capital. Right. And it would not invest in new planes until you could see a return on that capital. And you could see this downward spiral of old planes, a high cost to run. We're losing money because we're high cost, so we've got no money to invest in new planes, and therefore we're high cost. It's this vicious downward spiral. So the transformation was absolutely about making sure that the business returned its cost of capital so that we could invest for the future.
Yeah, interesting. And like you say, it's so easy, isn't it, for organisations to get into that downward spiral because until you actually started to invest, then the customer service experience would have been reduced. You know, you more competition coming into market. You just go lower and lower and lower, don't you? So yeah, absolutely understand that.
And it's also not just, sort of setting up for what's next. It's not just in the way we do things, but also the way we think about the world. You could see this real shift in from the history of the business, very focused, almost internally, to be much more about thinking about the world outside. And I see transformation as that shift in thinking as much as the shift in doing.
No, agree, and I think it's very interesting because that's culture, isn't it? And that's very difficult to change, in my experience, and takes sometimes many years to change. But you've got to start that process off somewhere.
Yeah, and as as we all know, it's a lot. I was going to say it's a lot easier to change when you've got a crisis. I mean, we had experience at Qantas. We experienced a loss. There's extremely high competition, so we're in a bad spot. The change isn't easy, but it makes it easier to have that clarity of purpose.
Yeah, it's that burning platform, isn't it? It's without a burning platform, it's very difficult to get people's mindsets into the new ways of working because they don't understand the rationale for the change. And but if there's a burning platform, they do, because it becomes the immediate driver, doesn't it? So.
Yeah, and there is an active debate as to whether a burning platform is this negative idea, or is it better to have something that draws you forward, the beach you're going to, the future that you want? And I can debate either. I mean, yes, it's better to have the positive that drives you forward, but sometimes that's not enough.
No, yeah, it reminds me actually of a program I got heavily involved in the last century as well. So when you mentioned that, it was one of the UK banks, and the burning platform was that there was a loss, although it was that they did everything to ensure that, from a public perspective, a bank at that time couldn't. It was unforeseeable for it to say that they'd made a loss. But in reality, it was very close to making a loss. So you could argue the burning platform was it's a bank in a loss-making position. We need to do something different. But actually, the chief exec at the time turned it on its head to say, we were 8 years away from the millennium, and he set the business up to drive $1 billion by the millennium. And in terms of profitability, and everyone caught hold of this $1 billion by the millennium, and I think from memory they did it in 6 years, so 2 years ahead of schedule. And it is, you could easily said the burning platform was the loss making position, but actually the thing that really drove the business forward, that everyone bought into and caught onto, was this phrase "$1 billion by the millennium."
Yeah.
So you've recently published a book, haven't you, Kieran? The Complete Project Toolkit: Using Design Thinking to Transform the Delivery of Your Hardest Projects. Can you provide the listeners with a brief summary of the approach that you discuss within the book?
Actually, what I might I'll tell you the story that sparked the book.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I was actually working on a turnaround of a large infrastructure project, and we'd gone out to a team dinner. And after the team dinner, the project analyst came up to me and said, and this was the guy who was working out what's our chance of success and doing all his stochastic analysis and details. And he said to me, "I know this dinner has improved our chance of success, but I don't know how to model it." And what that did for me was go, well, what's missing from the way we think about project complexity in the current model? And as I pulled it apart, I saw that standard project management thinking is actually based on science. It's trying to drive predictability and certainty and having a good repeatable process. And basically science tries to take the individual out of the equation.
Yeah.
You go back to the scientific revolution, that's what it was all about, this move from story to data. And you can draw those links on this scientific revolution through to modern project management. So I went looking for a different way of thinking. If it isn't a scientific model, what's the alternate model? And design thinking, which actually puts people at the center, look at the whole of the parts, not just individual bits, is a way of thinking that I think represents what's happening with complexity. So on the basis of that, I worked up a new toolkit around mindsets, practices, and skills that work well in complexity. They're tools and techniques that I've used on projects. And so, yeah, it's mindsets like be willing to give up knowing and always be curious about things. How do you hold space in complexity for things to emerge? What's the practices associated with that? Where you've got to give space for give time and space for things to emerge, but also you've got to keep moving. So you've got to find a way even when you don't know the way through. And the skills are things like, in those situations, how do you ask good questions? How do you sense and respond what's going on? So, yeah, the book came out from me just thinking, is there a better way to think about project management?
Interesting. And going back to the analyst there, then when you discussed that with him or her, what was their views of the toolkit that you ultimately developed, or the discussion that you had around the toolkit?
Yeah, they got it. They could read it. They could understand. Sorry, they could read it. They could understand it. But I still think they were very attached to the certainty that the numbers gave them.
Yeah.
For me, I'm talking about the ability to listen well, to actively break things on the project so that you learn, to bring this focus onto learning. And I think for that person, it was almost a step too far to think about it. But a lot of the senior program managers that I've spoken to see within this things that they're already doing.
Yeah.
So I think those who operate well in complexity would probably read the book and go, yes, that's now described what I do. But I do see the opportunity for people who are willing to sort of take on a different view or come at projects from a different direction is really what this book is about.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you just described there, people would typically say they're the soft skills. They are the they're the things that not technical. They're not processed. They're the softer skills. But actually, in reality, they're the hardest skills that it takes to develop. And some people quite natural, the way that they engage with people, the way that they interact with people is more from an inquisitive perspective, asking lots of questions. A lot of people that are so much more process driven are very rigid in the thinking, aren't they? And it's just, as you say, just a case of stepping back and creating that space to think differently and to look at things from a different perspective, and to engage with people in a much more real way.
Yes, and I think part of the difficulty is that a lot of project managers have technical backgrounds, have technical disciplines, and most technical disciplines have a right and wrong. And when you're right, and you're wrong. So you get paid for being right.
Yes.
And so this idea of which is again a very scientific mindset. Right, wrong is very scientific. But now you're managing people, and now you're into no longer a science-based approach, but one where you're dealing with a discussion or an argument or a conversation. And in those, listening becomes important, questioning becomes important. That's how you generate new knowledge, because the answer is generated by the group. I mean, I can give you another story, I think, that really shows the difference with complexity now. And that's from the Snowy Mountain scheme. Was a large infrastructure development in Australia. It started in 1949, and it was a big hydroelectricity irrigation scheme in southeastern Australia. Took 25 years to build, and we had to import a whole bunch of capability from overseas. They built dams, which created new lakes, flooded a few towns. But it was finished 25 years later in 1974, and it was considered nation building and one of the most amazing projects we've ever done. But the problem was, in the 1990s, they realized the environmental impact this was having, because the river was no longer flowing the way it used to. So there was an agreement to restore the flows. Now, all the arguments that went on, those flows downstream on the Snowy River were restored in 2017. The point of that is it took us 25 years to build this massive system, huge hundreds of kilometres of tunnels and pipes and dams. It took us 25 years to build that. It then took us 25 years to allow more water to flow down the river. And that's what's happening now, is that these projects have got more. It's no longer about the difficulty of constructing things. It's the argument you need to carry on with the locals or with social media. That's what's driving the complexity.
Yes.
And that brings forward a different toolkit for project managers today, where it's no longer purely about time and task and sequencing and getting things to turn up to site on time. It's about managing that broader context.
Yeah, we talk a lot on the pod about taking people on that journey, but I think what you've crystallised here is more about the how you look to take people on the journey. So you don't take them on the journey; you invite them into the journey and invite them to have an input into what that journey looks like, and by asking questions and listening to responses, then people will go on that journey with you, if it's the right journey for the organisation.
Yeah, and you know, that's one part of the skills. Another part of it is also, then what does that mean for your project? How do you rethink the approach? How do you sense and respond? How do you coordinate action when this thing's moving? So it's one thing. Yes, there's one thing about involving people, but there's also a point at which we've got to get this done.
Yeah,
and we've got to move forward on those.
I'm one of the tools that I'm accredited on is something called the GC Index, and an element of that looks at whether you are, as an individual, whether you are motivated more by people or more by tasks, and that balance between task focus and people focus. Fascinating tool if you've come across it, or certainly want to look at. But again, it's having that balance, isn't it? And all too often, people tend to be either very task focused or very people focused, and actually the skill is having that balance and taking people on a journey, but certainly making sure that we are progressing and we are moving towards the desired end result.
Yeah, and making it easier for them to understand why and where and how.
Yes, yeah. So on your LinkedIn profile, you also say that you have a passion for simplifying the way businesses operate and improve the existence for those involved. Do you want to just expand on that and what you mean by that, and give some examples of how you've done that?
Yeah, so for me, I think, and it's a big part of the whole complexity piece, is you need to simplify the world to be able to deal with it. When we allow complexity to run rampant, it just overloads us. And so I'm really interested in how we take the time to reframe things and simplify how things work. If I go back to Qantas, we had a situation there with the old 747s, brilliant aircraft. But when I started there, we had 7 different interior configs, internal configuration, seat arrangements, and the fleet was down to about 14 aircraft. So it's a massive amount of complexity in that.
Yeah.
Now, by the time I left, we were down to 2 configs. And that drives, without doing much else, it drives significant cost reduction. There's a simpler supply chain. It drives easier training, makes it easier to swap aircraft if there's any kind of problem that occurs. So for me, simplicity has the significant impacts all the way through cost, customer service, and just makes it easier to do your job. So for me, that's why simplicity is such a big thing. And within that, as I mentioned there, it makes it easier for people to do their job well. But the point about improving the experience of people, one thing I really believe is that, and it comes back to this difference between science and design. When it comes to science is very good for telling us how far we are away from the moon and measuring physical things. But design thinking is much more about the things where we get to decide how they operate. How big is the project team? What's the best form of taxation? There are a whole bunch of questions here that are things where we get to create the answer. There's no physical, gravitational constant we're dealing with here. We get to create the answer. And that's what it's like in organizations. And when we get to create the way we operate, we get to choose how the organization is set up. Is it going to be a generative place, or is it going to be a horrible place to work?
Yeah.
We get that choice.
And I agree that that drive to simplicity is the way forward, because over time you typically will find a process has been adapted to meet a specific need, and it's been adapted again and adapted again and adapted again. So suddenly you've got all these different variations of something that was originally very, very simple. And if you just go back to that simple way of working, often it works, but over time it's just got more and more complicated. And your example that you just give on Qantas there, I remember reading a book many years ago about Southwest Airlines, and the whole premise of Southwest Airlines, which was I think one of the first of the low cost operators, was we have one standard plane with one standard configuration, and it was just to get it down to just one version of everything, because then it becomes really easy to train people. People can really buy into it and deliver the best. And from a customer's perspective, they know what to expect. And they radically changed the airline industry, didn't they?
There's even stories of them ordering new aircraft, and so, if you like, dumbing down that aircraft, turning off some new features so they matched the previous ones until they got to a certain size where half the fleet, they can now turn that feature on. So you had that consistency. The other thing too, you mentioned there about the complexity growing. I also think that simplicity isn't simple.
No.
You can have simplistic changes. I'm going to get a bit detailed on the words here. You can make simplistic changes, but if you really want to simplify something, you have to really understand the situation, look at it in different ways. And I use the term that simplicity lies on the other side of complexity. You've got to go through the work, understand the situation to come up with a thing that cuts through, like your billion by the millennium. That cuts through. That wouldn't have been the first thing they thought of.
Absolutely. But it reminds me of a story that I heard, again, God knows, 30 years ago on one of the motivational audio tapes when audio tapes were a thing. And I can't remember who it was that was relaying the story. But the premise of the story was that someone had gone to Thanksgiving. It was an American story. Thanksgiving Day, and the turkey was cut in half, and the question was, why do you cut it in half? Well, that's because my mother used to do it, and that it was always the way that we would do it. Okay, so let's go and find out why your mother did it. So ask the question to the mother, why do you cut it in half? Well, that's the way that my mother used to do it. And the story then sort of expands through many sort of levels of family. And it turns out, well, that originally the original person that started the tradition, shall we say, that she had to cut the turkey in half because her oven wasn't big enough. And it was, wasn't it? The concept of just asking why do you do it in this way? Okay, but you do it. You've said that's the reason why, but why? And that sort of five whys approach I find really, really useful, because often people do stuff because other people have always done it that way, not necessarily because it's the right way of doing it.
Yeah, and actually, which triggers for me, one of the things I mentioned in the book is one of the mindsets is this: why before what? So, often on projects, particularly when there's complexity, where we don't quite understand, we'll just say, well, what do you want me to do? And in doing that, we now get clarity of what you've asked for, and I can go and deliver the what, the thing, the stuff, and I'll get the tick for delivering it, but it might miss the point because we never asked why. Change
is a constant. We know that, and that's why we operate in the way that we do. It gives us opportunities each and every day. You've got the highly competitive market conditions, disruptive technologies that are changing the face of traditional business models. We've just spoken about one in the way that the airline industry was changed. So how do you go about establishing the right conditions for that change, and equally maintaining the momentum as you go through the transformation? What are the key elements that you need to see within that transformation program?
I think there's really, for me, in terms of delivering a program, there are three sort of big levers that I go back to. And one we've talked to already, the clarity of purpose. Simplified to make it easy to communicate, to prioritize. When I go back to the electricity utility, we had two elements. It was reducing costs for customers and building the capability for the future. Those were the two things. You can carry them with you. 1 billion by the millennium, you can carry that with you. So both that clarity of purpose and making it easier to hold on to is really quite important. It keeps you moving through the hard times, through the uncertainty. And if you're unsure whether we're doing the right thing, you can anchor back on that. So that's the first thing, that clarity of purpose. I think the second thing to do well in transformation is actually it might seem opposite to what I mentioned in the book, but a structured approach to project management. I'm not saying that it needs to be the standard approach. You need to have a common way of operating so that people know the rules, know the language. You can't have everybody firing off in their own direction. You need to have this structured approach to cost, benefits, timing, resources, risks, dependencies, all those elements. And they need to be at the right level for the organisation. There was one place I worked where they had a 5-page document for benefit definition. And it was absolutely a waste of time. It had grown up over the years, but it was so countercultural. In fact, they had a name of it that they referred to it as a contract. People were unsure, is this part of my employment contract now? So we killed that off, right? It's got to, the approach that you use has to match the environment. You can't just come in, hey, this worked over there, let's put it in here. It's got to match the environment. You've got to have that clarity of rules. Down in detail, what resources get billed to projects? What defines a project versus BAU? Clarity of stage gates. So for me, I think this structured approach to the whole program is the second major piece that I always want to see is in place for these things to work well. And the third piece that I really focus on is having the right team, particularly the right team around me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll always want to know I've got a good finance person, a good project planner, a good change person, and a good architect. For me, they are the essential core to running a good program well. But the right team also extends to the stream leads. Generally, they tend to be operational people, don't have a project background. Often you need to educate them on what's different for a project versus operation. And I think I've found you also need to give them as much support, but also be willing to change them out if it isn't working. I've seen some really successful operational managers not be able to make that shift into a project environment. And I think also filling out the team, and this is, I think as I've got older, I'm more willing to use advisory services. You want to have a team or some individuals that you really trust. I mean, I was working on a program, we were spending $50 million on data, on analytics, on structuring the data. I didn't know if we were spending too much or too little. I just didn't know that topic well enough.
Yeah.
That's where an advisor helps. Integrating systems, some of these very technical environments, I'm looking for people who can explain it well. I mean, I've got an IT background, but I still rely on others to guide me through that. So for me, that third piece is having the right team around you.
Yeah, and I think what you've just described there, I think is a real sort of key strength of a good leader. It's to get people around you that are better than you in their core areas, so that you've got the best that you can possibly get around you, and then, as you say, engage with them, ask the right questions, bring them along, and that team then becomes really, really, really powerful. Just coming back to one of the things that you were just saying there, when you brought maybe an operational person into the project team and it's not worked out for them, all too often I find that there's a reluctance to remove people from the project team because the way that it comes across, the impact that it might have on the individual. So you then get blockages, and that can create problems in itself. So how do you go about can you just talk through some of the approach that you take in terms of taking those people out that are not really adding not necessarily adding value, but not necessarily the right type of person that you need within the project?
Yeah, there's a few things on that. One is that, and I'm talking about the stream lead rather than the sponsor. Yeah, changing a sponsor is really hard. Yes, that's a whole different conversation. But changing a stream lead, it's never just a surprise. It's not like you've suddenly decided that, hey, it's Monday, we need to change somebody out. This is often something that's not the first conversation. There's been a few discussions, but it's the conversation with the sponsor who is accountable for the outcome. I'm worried about the outcome. And for me as a program director, transformation lead, I'm standing in the result we're trying to create. And really what I'm fundamentally saying here is that we can get that result better. It's better for everyone. I've seen some people drowning in these roles. They're just not enjoying it. It's going to be better for the individual. It's going to be better for the result, that we change things up. Now, the messaging around that, you've got to do it with care, and it's got to match the organisation. I mean, I do know of I've been involved in a number of organisations where projects are seen as an exit lounge, and they want to get back to the operation because they worry that if you get shoved on a project, you're no good at your job, which is really the wrong way to be. But so for me, it's a careful conversation, and it can't be a surprise.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like, as you say, it's taking the emotion out of it, isn't it, and focusing on the outcomes. And when you do that, and I often find that, as you just said, it won't come as a surprise to a person, and actually, it's the right that they feel it's the right solution for them. So they're not necessarily enjoying themselves in the project as well. So
there's normally a sense of relief.
Yeah, absolutely. So just coming towards the end of our session today, we always end with one question. So if you could only have one thing that is the essential part of successful transformation, what's that one takeaway for that you want to leave people with today?
Yeah, I think if there's only one thing, for me, transformation, the fundamental thing you've got to get right is the willingness to learn. For me, learning is absolutely central to the journey. You've got to be open to new ideas. You've got to be asking why, because the reality is, in a transformation, nobody has done this in this situation with this bunch of people. So if you believe that you've got it under control, in fact, on one of my recent roles, I sat down all the workstream leads and said to them, we need to agree that we don't know what we're doing here. We have to be prepared to learn. More than just new skills. It's really at the idea of learning is about sensing and responding as things emerge. How do we take that and adjust what we're doing or confirm what we're doing? But that's the thing for me. Set up the agreement with everybody that we're going to learn.
That's not come up before, which is really good. But yeah, totally accept and totally agree with you. It's having that ability, isn't it? That we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Often, we might have a good idea, but you never know because things happen. And unfortunately, a lot of people, when stuff happens that we're not expecting, react to it. And what I take from what you've just said, it's step back and respond to it, investigate, understand, ask questions, and then responding. And responding is 99% better in my experience than reacting to stuff.
And I think also there is this tendency in projects to focus on setting up process and managing compliance to the process. And yes, I'll go back to the second point I had before about, yes, you do need good process, but that can't be the be all and the end all. You've got to be willing to listen.
It's one of the three things that you spoke about. It's not in itself, it's not the one thing. It's one of the three things. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Kieran. That was really great, and thanks for your stories and your insights. And so if people are looking to get hold of your book, where can they find it?
Yeah, so it's called The Complex Project Toolkit. Not too sure. It's on Amazon. I'm not too sure how many countries have covered it at the moment, but it is on a website called the Book Depository, I believe, and they can ship worldwide.
Right, okay.
Or track me down on LinkedIn. Drop me a note on LinkedIn. I can always.
Well, what we do on the show notes, we'll share your LinkedIn profile, so people can connect to you via the show notes as well, and we'll also we'll look for the link on Amazon and drop that into the show notes. Fantastic. Well, brilliant. And if anyone has any questions, are you happy for me to collate them and get them over to you? And we can go back on a one-to-one basis.
Completely fine with that. Be good, particularly if anybody reads the book and has some alternate views on it. I'm certainly open to any kind of feedback. Brilliant. Well, once again, thanks a lot, Kieran. And great way to spend 3/4 an hour. Yeah, thanks for your time.
Once again, thank you, Kieran. That was a really great session. The Transformation Leaders Hub is growing from strength to strength. So if you haven't already, check it out at www.thetransformationleadershub.com. It's a great way to build your network, interact with other people who operate within change and transformation, and who knows, create opportunities for each other. So hopefully I'll see you within the community very soon, and look forward to catching up with you again on the next show in a couple of weeks' time.